Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. So today we're looking at forgiveness.
Ooh, that's a big one.
It is right. And we've got a really interesting mix of sources for this one. We've got this article from Greater Good magazine, and then there's this whole Reddit thread, just people sharing their personal experiences with forgiveness. Oh, and then we've got this therapist's perspective from a site called Therapy in a Nutshell. I'm really curious to see where this all goes. What do you think? Ready to jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so right off the bat, one thing that really stood out to me um, was how many of these sources, all of them really, were really emphasizing what forgiveness is not.
Yeah, that's true. Like, they're not saying just forget about it or pretend it didn't even happen.
Exactly. And it's definitely not about saying like, oh, it's totally fine that you did that. You know what I mean? Like, especially in that Reddit thread, people were really struggling with that. Like, how do you forgive someone without kind of minimizing the wrong that they did?
Right, right. Like, forgiving someone doesn't mean what they did was okay. I think that's a big misconception about forgiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a lot of the sources were saying it's really more of an internal thing. It's about letting go of that resentment and anger that you're carrying around,
Hmm.
for your own good.
Yeah. And the therapist, the Therapy in a Nutshell video, her name's Emma McAdam. She makes this really great analogy. She's like, imagine holding on to resentment is like carrying around this heavy shield all the time. Forgiveness is about putting the shield down so you can actually like move freely again.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, me too. It's like forgiveness is kind of an act of self-care, like taking care of yourself.
Totally. And empowering yourself too, not letting that person have power over you anymore.
Exactly. And a lot of people in the Reddit thread were echoing that. Like one person said, being angry and holding on to it is like being in a prison. Once you forgive, you free yourself. I thought that was so powerful.
Yeah, that's really good. So we talked about what forgiveness isn't, but then the question is, well, what is it then? And like, why should we even bother?
Right, right. Like what's in it for us?
Exactly. And honestly, all these sources, they make a really strong case for the benefits of forgiveness, even when like getting back together with the person isn't possible, or even desirable, really.
Yeah, and there's actually research on this. The Greater Good article really digs into it. They talk about how working on forgiveness can actually lead to like higher self-esteem, a
Hmm.
sense of inner strength, and eventually just a more meaningful life overall.
Wow. So it can really make a difference in your life. And it's not just mental either, right?
Right. There's research showing that forgiveness can impact physical health too. Like it can help reduce stress and anxiety
Yeah.
and maybe even lessen some of the symptoms of depression.
Interesting. So many benefits. I'm also seeing this connection between forgiveness and having better relationships. And I don't just mean with the person that you're forgiving.
Oh yeah, I see what you mean. Like if you're holding on to anger towards one person,
Yeah.
it can like spill over into your other relationship.
Yeah, exactly. Like several of the sources mention that. Even the Reddit thread, it's like that unresolved anger can make it harder to trust people and just connect with them in general.
It's like you're still carrying that heavy shield even when you're around other people.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
In the Reddit thread, I liked what one user said, Amaranth too. He said they try to remember the good things about the person they're trying to forgive as like a starting point. You were saying, like genuinely sitting and processing why you care about them and what value they bring can be a really good first step. Yeah, I don't know. I just thought that was a cool way to look at it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it seems like forgiveness isn't just some vague idea. It's something you can actually like work towards.
Yeah, totally. So then the question is, how do you actually do that?
Hmm.
Like, what are the steps involved in forgiving someone?
Right. Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that it's not like flipping a switch. It's a process. It takes time, it takes effort.
It's a journey.
Exactly. But luckily, these sources actually give us some pretty good frameworks for like navigating that journey, like roadmaps.
I like that. Roadmaps. So
Hmm.
where these roadmaps start? What's step one?
Well, I think a lot of them emphasize the importance of honestly assessing whether you're actually ready to forgive. You got to be real with yourself about where you're at emotionally.
Yeah, like the therapist, Emma McAdam. She warns against what she calls cheap forgiveness. She says that's when you say the words, but you haven't really dealt with your feelings yet.
Right. It's not about just pushing your feelings down and pretending you're not hurt. The Fearless Living website actually talks about how forgiveness requires opening your heart. And that might mean that you have to feel those feelings of hurt even more intensely for a little bit as you're working through them.
So it's about acknowledging the pain, not denying it.
Exactly. And I think the Greater Good article suggests that working through that pain is actually a really important step. Like, it might involve journaling, therapy, maybe even other healthy coping mechanisms, just whatever helps you process what happened and start to heal.
Yeah. There was a Redditor who put it really well. They said, don't forgive them for them. Forgive them for your benefit.
Ooh, I like that. It really brings it back to you and how forgiveness can help you heal.
Exactly. Okay, so we've acknowledged the pain,
Mhm.
but then what? What's the next step in this forgiveness roadmap?
So this is where it can get a little tricky because a lot of the sources talk about cultivating compassion and empathy as the next step.
Okay, but that doesn't mean that we're saying what the person did was okay.
Right,
Uh,
right, right. It's more about trying to understand their perspective, like their motivations, their struggles, even if you don't agree with them.
It's about recognizing their humanity, even if you don't condone their actions.
Yes, exactly.
I like how the Greater Good article puts it. They say, try to understand the offender's motivations, even if you don't agree with them. Remember that everyone makes mistakes.
Yeah. And the Fearless Living website takes it even further, saying, full forgiveness requires you to drop the blame and be willing to see yourself and others as innocent.
See yourself and others as innocent? What do you think that means?
I think it's about recognizing that we all mess up sometimes. We all do things we regret, and we all deserve compassion even when we make mistakes.
I see. So it's not just about letting go of resentment towards the other person, but also towards ourselves, like any self-blame that we might be holding on to.
That's a good point. It's about letting go of judgment, both of ourselves and others, and that can be really powerful. Okay, so we've talked about acknowledging the pain and cultivating compassion. What else is there?
Yeah, what else is on this forgiveness roadmap?
Well, a lot of the sources also talk about setting boundaries.
Oh, right. Because forgiving someone doesn't mean you have to let them back into your life or let them hurt you again.
Exactly. And the Fearless Living piece says, if someone violated your boundaries, consequences should follow, whether that's conversation or just taking a step back from the relationship. But you can maintain boundaries and still forgive.
So you can let go of the negative feelings without putting yourself in a risky situation.
Exactly. And this actually leads into a really important distinction that a lot of these sources make between reconciliation and letting go.
Oh, interesting. What's the difference?
So the Psyche Guides piece explains it like this. Interpersonal forgiveness means letting go of bad feelings and fixing the relationship. But then there's intrapersonal forgiveness, which is about letting go of the negative feelings without necessarily getting back together with the person.
Oh, that's really helpful, especially when, the other person isn't sorry for what they did, or if it's just not safe to try and rebuild the relationship, you can still forgive them, even if you don't reconcile.
Exactly. And that's kind of what the therapist Emma McAdam was saying too. Like, forgiveness isn't about waiting for an apology. It's about freeing yourself from the pain.
I love how one Redditor put it. They said, instead, focus on making peace with yourself about what happened. Take the steps you can to protect yourself in the future. Accept that they did not, and probably never will, get what's coming to them, and that you have a better life awaiting you once you let this situation go.
That's great advice. It's about taking control of your own healing.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about why forgiveness is important and some of the steps involved, but how do we make this like a regular thing? How do we incorporate forgiveness into our daily lives?
That's a great question. And actually, a lot of these sources give some pretty practical advice for that.
Oh, good. So what do they suggest?
Well, for example, the Zen Habits website talks about the importance of commitment, like really deciding that you're going to let go even if it takes time. They say commit to changing because you recognize that the pain is hurting you. I like that. It's acknowledging that this is a process and it's not always easy.
It reminds me of something from the Fearless Living website. Each day, you may need to choose to forgive again.
Yeah, exactly. It's an ongoing thing. And it takes effort. The Healthline article also suggests making a conscious effort to focus on the good things in your life and to work toward your own happiness.
That's so important. Focusing on the positive and taking care of yourself.
Yeah, and it reminds us that forgiveness is ultimately about reclaiming our power and choosing to live a life that's not ruled by resentment.
One of the Redditors, Penguin37, had a really interesting suggestion. They said, you can find forgiveness in compassion. Find the angle of the situation where your heart can say, that person must have been hurting an awful lot to behave that way.
It's a good one. It encourages us to see the humanity in others, even when they've hurt us.
Yeah. And maybe that's where forgiveness really begins. with that willingness to see beyond the surface and connect with that shared humanity.
Beautifully said. I really like that.
One of the things that I've been thinking about as we've been talking about all of this is like, how do you actually forgive yourself?
Yeah, that's tough.
Right? It is. It is. And it seems like it comes up a lot of these sources too.
It really does.
Like in the Greater Good article, they actually have like a whole section on self-forgiveness. It's not just about other people. It's also about, showing ourselves that same grace and compassion.
Yeah, for sure. And Enright, the author, he really talks about honoring yourself even when you make mistakes, because it's easy to get stuck in that self-loathing, especially when you've really messed up. But he's saying we need to move towards self-compassion instead.
I feel like that really resonated with some of the things that people were saying in that Reddit thread too. Like, I remember one person, I think their username was actually deleted, but they said something like, forgiveness is about finding the place where the wrong someone has done no longer bothers you. And they said that might look different for everyone, and it might not always be possible to like completely get there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not about just suddenly never being bothered by it again. It's more about making progress.
So how do we even begin to work towards that, especially when it comes to like forgiving ourselves?
Well, I think the therapist from Therapy in a Nutshell, she had some really good advice for this, especially for people who've been through, abuse or trauma.
Oh, right, Emma McAdam.
Yeah, her.
Yeah.
She was talking about the importance of working through any shame that might be there and really understanding like where the responsibility actually lies. She said, it was not your fault, which I think is so important for people to hear.
It is, because it's so easy to get caught up in self-blame, even when, it wasn't your fault at all.
Exactly. And she also talked about how self-forgiveness might sometimes involve asking for forgiveness from other people that you've hurt or trying to make amends.
So it can also be about our actions, not just our feelings.
Right. And even just being patient with yourself if that forgiveness isn't like immediately given.
That's a good point. So even when we're trying to forgive ourselves, it can involve other people too. It's not just an internal thing.
Yeah, totally. It's all connected, like how we forgive other people is connected to how we forgive ourselves. And then both of those things affect, how happy we are and how well we connect with others.
I like that. It reminds me of something we were talking about earlier, about how forgiveness can actually make the world a better place. Remember that part in the Greater Good article about developing a forgiving heart?
Yeah, and how that can create more forgiveness in our families, our communities, and even like in the workplace.
Exactly. It's about choosing to respond to hurt with understanding and empathy, instead of just getting stuck in that cycle of anger and revenge.
It's not about saying that harmful behavior is okay. It's about finding a different way to deal with it.
Like one of the Redditors said, try to have compassion for the other person. Most people are not bad. They just have certain weaknesses, insecurities, etc.
That's a good point. We're all human, and we all mess up sometimes.
So as we're kind of wrapping up this deep dive into forgiveness, it seems like it's about so much more than just saying, I forgive you.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary.
It's this whole journey, and what we've seen from all these sources is that there's no one right way to do it. But even though it can be tough, everyone seems to agree that forgiveness can be really powerful and it can really change your life for the better.
Absolutely. It's definitely worth the effort.
Now that we've talked all about letting go of resentment and revenge, I have a question for you to think about. How does that fit in with accountability? Can someone still be held accountable for what they did, even after they've been forgiven?
That's a really good question. It makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. It makes you think about, like, how do we balance wanting justice with wanting to heal and maybe even reconcile?
It's complex, and it's something that we can keep exploring,
It is, and that's what makes it so interesting. As we've been talking about all of this, I've been wondering, like, does it work differently in different kinds of relationships? Like, is it harder to forgive someone you're really close to? Or is it maybe harder to forgive, like, a stranger?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm not sure. Probably depends on the situation, right?
Yeah, I think so. Like, what happened, how close you are to the person.
Yeah. And maybe, like, what you expect from that relationship, too. Like, maybe we expect more from people we're close to, so it's more disappointing when they hurt us.
Right. That makes sense. But then maybe it's easier to forgive a stranger because, I don't know, you just don't have as much history with them.
Yeah, maybe. I did notice that a lot of people in that Reddit thread were talking about forgiving family members, like parents, siblings, even their spouse.
Yeah, those are tough ones. Family's complicated.
It is. And it's not always just a one-time thing either. Like sometimes there's a pattern of behavior that keeps hurting you.
Right. So it's not just about forgiving one specific event, it's about finding a way to like deal with that ongoing hurt.
Yeah. Boundaries are probably really important in those situations.
Definitely. It makes me wonder, sometimes is forgiveness more about protecting yourself than it is about the other person? That's an interesting thought.
Like, it's not always about saying what they did was okay. Sometimes it's more about realizing that holding on to that anger, it's just hurting you more than it's hurting them.
So forgiveness becomes a way to choose peace for yourself, even if the other person never apologizes.
Exactly. It's about you taking back your own power, which is something we've talked about a lot. It really is an act of self-love.
It is. Something else I was thinking about, and I don't know if any of the sources mention this, but like, what about time? Does time really heal all wounds? Do you think that's true?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know. It probably depends on the person.
Yeah. For some people, maybe time helps them get some distance from what happened, but for others, maybe it's harder to let go, even after a long time.
Right. And it also depends on, like, if the person who hurt you, if they've even acknowledged what they did or apologized.
True, true. That can make a big difference.
Definitely. Like, have they tried to make things right? Yeah. But then sometimes, even if they haven't done any of those things, you might still choose to forgive them, just so you can move on.
Yeah, that's true. Ultimately, it's your choice. You get to decide, no matter what the other person does.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. So, after this deep dive into forgiveness, I think one thing's for sure, it's definitely complicated.
Yeah, lots of layers to it.
But the good news is, it seems like pretty much everyone agrees. Forgiveness is possible,
Mm,
and it can have a huge impact on your life.
it can. It really can.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into forgiveness. We hope it's given you some things to think about, maybe even inspired you to try and practice forgiveness in your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. And keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep learning. It's a journey.
It is. And remember, you have the power to choose forgiveness.